Hey there, it's Lizzie, and today let's make a paper camera. Not a particularly useful camera, like the kind you're used to that can probably take pictures. This camera is special and different. It can't take pictures because it's made out of paper. However, it can tell a story because we'll paint some itty-bitty pictures and then swap them out one by one, like frames in a movie. I've written an itty-bitty story about a cat burglary to go along with the digital download kit, which has 6 paintings we'll make to tell the story. But there's also a set of blank pictures if you'd like to use your own. I'll start off by transferring the illustrations to watercolor paper using a light box. If you're making the pre-colored version, you would skip this step. And if you're coloring it yourself like I am, you can either print on cardstock or watercolor paper and work on that, or trace onto watercolor paper like I'm doing. I'm starting with the main body of the camera, then we'll add everything else to that. So once I have my sketch, I'll score the fold lines and cut everything out. Then work on cutting out the decorative pieces that go on the camera. Once everything is cut out and ready, it's time to pick paint colors. I like to use these individual paint swatches on paper tiles rather than swatching everything on a single piece of paper, since I find it to be much easier to see which colors will match if I'm only looking at the colors that I'm planning to use for a particular painting. Then once I have a stack of the colors I'm thinking of using, I can see only those and not all of the other ones, because I found before when I was just using a single piece of paper that my color choices were being pretty strongly affected by the colors that were next to each other on the swatch page, which doesn't really have any bearing at all to how a painting will look in the end. I like to start off with 1 or 2 colors that I'm totally sure I'm going to use, that either they're favorite colors that I use a lot or ones I wanted to try, but either way you could think of it as an anchor color for the rest of the illustration. And then of course you need lighter colors or darker colors for sky or trees for whatever it is you're going to be painting. But I find rather than just looking at the whole pile, being overwhelmed by the number of choices, starting off with one color and then making sure that everything else will match that color helps me be a little bit less overwhelmed. once I have all of the colors picked out and corralled, then I decide what order I want them in on the palette, and it's finally time to start setting up the palette. Because I'm using acrylic gouache, which once it's dry, stays dry forever and can't be reactivated with water, I'm using what's called a stay wet palette, which has an absorbent sponge underneath. I use a piece of parchment paper, but it has specialty paper you can get to use instead. And then it has an airtight lid and it helps keep acrylic paint or acrylic gouache wet for longer. You can actually easily make a DIY version with any sort of sealable container like a Tupperware, and then a sponge or some damp paper towels and a piece of parchment paper. And of course I need some paintbrushes depending on what size the painting is and what shapes I'll be painting. And then it's time to mix up some colors. I used vermilion as kind of the anchor color for this illustration. And I really wanted the camera to be red but not all the way vermilion, so I mixed it with some other colors as well as some acrylic mediums. You can use regular acrylic mediums like paint retarder or wetting aid with acrylic gouache, and I find that makes it much easier to work with. You don't technically have to paint the edges of the pieces, particularly if you're doing the pre-colored version of the camera, but I find that it creates a much more finished look at the end, so I like to do that. This is my favorite trick for putting glue on tiny areas so you can control the amount and exactly where it goes. I make a little puddle of glue on some scrap paper, and then I cut a bunch of small pieces of scrap paper, about a 1/4 inch maybe by 1 inch or 2 inches. Then I use it to almost stamp or paint the glue onto the surface where I want glue, and it lets me prevent any big glue puddles or areas that don't get enough glue. And then you only ever have just a little bit of wet glue on that scrap paper, so I don't find that it tends to waste a lot, which is nice. Here I'm working on assembling all of the pieces for the main camera lens. So this will be the part where we swap out all of the removable photos later on, which technically isn't how cameras work, but it's how this camera works. And that dark piece of paper will go behind the lens, and it would be what you see when there aren't any photos installed in the lens. So I think that would be a really fun spot to include something silly or a little surprise. Although for this particular illustration I just left it dark because otherwise you would see the white interior of the camera, which I thought would be kind of distracting. So here's the lens, and then in that little gap is where we'll put the pictures once we've painted them. So after that I cleaned up any bits that got paint or where the paint had gotten damaged, and then it was time to move on to the upper lens. These older style of cameras seem to have 2 lenses on the front typically, and so while the main one will be where we do the illustrations, I wanted the second lens to also be 3-dimensional. And then of course we'll have 2 movable knobs, one on each side of the camera. So this one's not technically movable. I guess it's the only non-interactive 3D part of the camera, but I found that it was important that it look that way. And then the movable knob on the side of the camera is actually built the same way, which is super handy, so that's what we're working on now. And then right next to my fingers you can see the top lens that we built. And then gluing on the decorative portions. The nice thing about this kit is that you can skip cutting out and gluing those on if you want to, because they're printed on the kit directly. So while they add a fun 3D element, they're not strictly necessary if you want something to be slightly quicker. On this one, because we want the knob to be able to spin, we don't want to glue anything to the teeth on the back. So I glued a piece of paper around the teeth to keep the knob from falling out of the camera. I suppose falling into the camera. But didn't glue anything to the teeth themselves. Now we're working on the crank, which is essentially just a knob with a handle, and a lot of these older cameras seem to have. I'm not totally positive what the knob or the crank would be used for, but that's what we're making. And what I was using there is a ball stylus. I usually use a bone folder, which is a little bit less likely to damage the paper, but the ball stylus can be handy for scoring really tiny areas that are super delicate. This is the little ring that will go on top of the crank to just kind of be cute and decorative. And then there is my studio buddy Rufus coming to inevitably steal important bits of paper and never scrap paper. He has a very discerning paper palette. Then a little bit more painting. It was fun going back and forth between cutting and scoring and painting for all the different camera parts. It would technically be a little bit more efficient to cut everything and then paint everything, but a lot of the pieces are really similar in size and shape, and unless you labeled everything very carefully, it would be really easy to get everything mixed up. Not that it would be impossible to do, just I think a little bit more likely to end up with parts that maybe didn't fit together quite the way you had hoped. So this is the kind of outer decorative ring, and of course more of the little decorative elements. And I find when I'm gluing pieces of paper on, sometimes a little bit of extra glue slips out, even if you were careful about how much you applied. And using the corner of one of those bits of scrap paper, you can scrape off that extra glue so that it doesn't dry and leave extra glue everywhere. So this is the handle, and I'm gluing the back side of it onto the back side of the knob. You can see that the front side sticks out the front side of the knob, and then just like we did for the other side, I'm gluing something around the teeth but not to the teeth so that our crank can twist. And then finally I'm going in with a little bit of paint and adding, I guess maybe bolts or rivets, whatever they used to attach the decorative elements to the camera, and then I get to fold it into an actual camera and wait very patiently for the glue to dry. Okay, not that patiently. I'm not super patient, but I did have to wait for the glue to dry regardless of how patient I was feeling. These little teeth on the top are kind of a pain to cut out and to glue, but I find that they help a lot in making the arched top of the camera sit smoothly. And then on this bottom part, what's kind of fun is that if you don't glue it in place, you can use the interior of the camera to store the extra pictures when you're not using them, so that they don't wander off as small pieces of paper so often do. And then of course here is the finished camera itself, with the knob that moves and the top and bottom lenses and the crank that moves. You can't use the handle of the crank depending on how everything's assembled, but you can use the vertical portion, horizontal portion, like the round bit, to spin the crank. Now of course we need the photos for our cameras so we can tell a story. This picture is, I think, the first one out of the 6. And so I added a little handle on the side of each of them so that they're easier to get in and out of the camera. And I didn't attach them all together at the end. I couldn't decide whether or not I wanted to. But I made the round part on the right side of the handle big enough to where if you have a small hole punch, you could punch a hole in them and then stack them all in order and tie them together with a piece of string or a ribbon, and then use them all without them getting mixed up for the order you choose. These ones of course have a suggested order because there's a story that goes with them, but if you are writing your own story or using your own pictures, or just want to use these pictures to tell a different story, they could also be in a different order. And then because this video is already pretty long, we will use the magic of editing to paint these last few. And then the final step is to glue a little ring onto the top of each of these, because the camera has all these decorative fun 3D elements, and so I felt like the pictures needed decorative fun 3D elements. And I'm using that same technique of kind of stamping on the glue so I can get just a little bit on each of these, and then of course scraping any extra bits of glue that end up in places we don't want them to be. One of the nice things with gluing the rings onto the top of the photos is that you don't have to have perfectly neat edges when you paint the photos. You can just glue the ring on top and then the edges disappear, which is super neat. And then, of course, here's the finished camera, and we'll be able to swap out the pictures to tell a story. First, though, we have to enjoy the interactive 3D elements because I just love art and craft projects that you can touch and move and use. There's a lot to be said for beautiful art that hangs on a wall, but there's also something really fun about art that you can pick up and hold and play with, and I think this camera is a good mix of both. And now for our story. Once upon a time, there was an amateur detective who loved photography. She went on a tour of a lovely English manor house. The tour began in the kitchens, where she got a lovely picture of cat paw prints and some spilled flour. The tour then moved on to the main event, the world-famous bejeweled milk saucer. But alas, the saucer and other jewels were missing. Pay no mind to the cat hiding behind the chair. I'm sure it's not up to anything. The show must go on, though, so the tour moved on to the gardens, where our detective, while getting a picture of the lovely foliage, captured something suspicious going on up by the windows. Our intrepid detective followed the suspicious creatures and got them red-pawed in the gardens, knocking the bejeweled milk saucer off the garden wall. They were cat burglars. The jewels were returned to the highly secure table in the middle of an open room, and the day was saved. For now. The end. Thank you so much for crafting with me today. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next project.